Okay, well, thank you, Adina, for that warm welcome. And it's actually wonderful to be here because the opportunity that Responsible Tech has presented unexpectedly has actually given me the chance to think sort of a bit more deeply about a question that sort of does keep me up at night and is the bulk of my work at CSIRO. And that is, how do you answer the question, what is responsible tech? And I'm actually really deeply interested in that. You know, can I pick it in a lineup? Will I know that it's present because suddenly, you know, all of these opportunities and kind of excellent experiences are being unlocked in my life? Or is it a little bit different? Is responsible tech present and I don't really know about it, but the fact is my life isn't kind of falling apart all around me? And so I'm quite interested in the kind of the aspirations and the expectations we have about responsible tech and how close or far we are from that reality. And so, as Adina mentioned, I lead a program of research in CSIRO that's about responsible innovation. And I was really interested in then playing with this idea of responsibility in our innovation processes and also what it means in terms of, you know, the technology that we create and whether there's a link between those two things. And so what I thought I'd do today is talk for about 20 minutes, and I'm going to share some of the things and the ideas that we're working with in different projects to sort of just frame how we think about responsibility and some of the stuff that we are still grappling with. And so I am now going to attempt to share my slides. And so hopefully that has come up. What I'm going to do is actually start by introducing a fairly big program of research that we kicked off in about 2016, and it's called our Future Science Platforms. And that's about $200 million worth of investment in areas of what we identify as future science and technology for the nation. Now, they're very diverse and there's 11 of them, but I want to give you this context just to give you a sense of when I'm thinking about technology or future science, it's not just AI, it's not just big data, although those things are present. But what is common about these areas is that they've been identified as probably areas of research that are going to disrupt our current industries, create new industries in Australia, but they're also areas where we think that need the most, I guess, what we would call capability development. So who are the future scientists and technology developers that are going to make these areas possible for us? So what I want to do is start by introducing 10 of the 11 future science platforms in CSIRO, just to give you a sense of the breadth here. And I won't kind of labour this too much because they are quite diverse. But if we start with active integrated matter, here we have a whole portfolio of research, which is about how do you converge big data, advanced autonomous systems, and materials science? So this is actually about the future of manufacturing in Australia. And we could be talking about personalised food and therapeutics right through to, you know, completely human-free, you know, totally autonomous dark factories. So this is about a smarter and more environmentally sustainable kind of manufacturing for the future. Probing biosystems is about real-time interrogation of biological systems, but particularly for medical care. So the kinds of projects that we see in this area are, how do you develop wearable nanoneedle sensors for use in medical care? How do we develop diagnostics for earlier detection of cancer? And one that's incredibly topical at the moment, how do we respond more quickly to infectious pandemics? Environomics. This is a whole area of research that's actually about how do you take environmental genomics to increase our understanding of the environment? How can we better manage natural resources if we understand them down to the molecular biology level? And that includes things like, how can we better understand the resilience and the evolution of species under a changing climate? Hydrogen energy, here's one that's about what is the underlying technology that's required to completely disrupt an energy system? So if we were to have hydrogen energy as part of Australia's energy system, what would it take in terms of moving us towards reducing our carbon emissions, but also to create what we might consider a responsible hydrogen industry in this country? Space technology is very different again. This is about tripling the Australian space industry by 2030. And the kinds of innovations they're looking at are new technologies in Earth observation, in satellite communications, but also off-Earth mining and space biomedicine. If we go deep under the ground, deep Earth imaging is actually about how do you take very sophisticated approaches to surface modelling that we currently use and apply that to deep below the Earth's surface, with the purpose of, more accurately identifying the presence of minerals, energy resources, but also water resources in what is a very dry continent. Digiscape is another big data one. So how do you harness the digital revolution in the production of, food in this country? So basically, creating a common big data infrastructure that's going to transform decision making in our agricultural industries, but with a real focus on transformation of economic and environmental performance. Synthetic biology, again, quite different. So genetic engineering, but as applied across a range of portfolios. So this is about how do you apply it into industrial biotechnology, into our manufacturing industries, into healthcare, into agriculture. And I mean, the applications of this are incredibly diverse. So you might be talking about, creating fabrics that don't require ironing on the one hand, right through to the creation of genetically modified organisms like coral, or it could be mammals in our biosecurity responses. Precision health is actually about transforming, I guess, the whole paradigm of healthcare in this country. So this again is a massive disruption. But precision health is working with communities to understand what it would take to shift our current healthcare system from disease response and treatment to disease prevention. And that's no small thing. And finally, of course, we do have an artificial intelligence and machine learning future science platform, which is asking really specific questions about science as one of the areas of focus. So how should scientists be using machine learning to change the way we do our research? But also we're looking at some of the similar conversations that are going to come up, I think, throughout the week around how do you sort of deal with domain constraints like physical laws, but also design constraints about embedding things like privacy and fairness in our machine learning models. And so I wanted to introduce that, even though it seems kind of crazily large, but in CSIRO, when we're starting to think about what are the areas of future or disruptive science and technology that we're anticipating, it is very broad. And so we introduced one more future science platform to that, which is the Responsible Innovation Future Science Platform. And this is the area I work in. And basically this is then a dedicated response to how are we going to go about assessing the risks, the benefits and uncertainties that might be associated with those kinds of portfolios of science and technology development. And we've indicated that there's two really big things that this area of research needs to achieve, and you can see that they're pretty broad. The first one is about how do we ensure that we design and deliver responsible science and technology for the benefit of all Australians, and that is very big. So if we can do that, we're doing pretty well. But alongside that, and really importantly, and this doesn't come to us straight away, it takes us a couple of years of work before we realise how important the second is, how do we develop the capabilities that will catalyse the adoption of whatever it is we think is responsible science and technology by the people who have to use it. And so we're going to hear a lot about the importance of trust in technology by the people that need to make decisions with it or use it on a daily basis. But alongside those end users, how are we also going to equip communities to be able to assess the challenges or the trade-offs that are going to be associated with the uptake of some of these areas of science and technology in our lives? And that doesn't imply that there's always going to be a decision to be made, but sometimes there will. So that's the context of the research portfolios that I'm working within and around in CSIRO. But one of the questions that I'm quite interested in is what is technology? Oh, sorry, what is responsibility? Because in my darkest moments, I will actually sort of think, gosh, is responsibility sort of a word that's somewhat like sustainability, in that, you know, we've seen sustainability used over the past couple of decades, sometimes quite opportunistically, sometimes to signal aspiration, but not always to kind of talk about what we're really doing. But I tend not to be kind of thinking in that space all of the time. And I do have kind of hopes that we can use responsibility quite usefully and effectively. And so I want to introduce you very quickly to some work that's been done by Ivo van der Pol, who's from the Delft University of Technology, and his work is a piece of work we're drawing on at the moment in a project that we have running on ethics and the use of evolutionary algorithms in the creation of bespoke healthcare robotics. And so why it's interesting is that it talks about responsibility as something that can be both forward-looking and backward-looking. And so we really need to get to grips on where we're operating when we're talking about this in responsibility. So by forward-looking, I just mean forward-looking responsibility is making sure that we kind of design in or kind of create a certain set of affairs or events coming to pass. And often that's what we're doing when we're thinking about technology. It's very anticipatory. We're thinking about the future. And backward looking is how do we deal with something after the fact? And sometimes we need to do both. But let me introduce you to 9 different ways that Van der Pol says responsibility might easily be defined. And I'll quickly just talk you through them, not in too much detail. But I want to just kind of run through this list because I'm convinced that, you know, we're not all going to have the same thing in our heads and our hearts when we start to talk about responsibility. And so it's worth thinking that there's a couple of, well, there's actually many different ways that we might be conceiving of it. So some of them are really obvious to us. So if we think about responsibility as cause, that's pretty straightforward. So something happens, it causes an effect. And so the example that Van der Pol uses is that we might say the earthquake is responsible for the death of 100 people. So that's cause responsibility. But we might also have role or task responsibility. So this is about where we've got responsibility assigned to the delivery of a specific role. So the example here might be the train driver is responsible for driving the train. Now that's a pretty quaint and perhaps old-fashioned example in the face of autonomous transport, but I'm going to use the train driver again. Responsibility as authority is about having the authority to make decisions about something, to lead actions about something. So it can be an individual or it can be an organization, but just say for argument's sake, you know, you're in charge of a project, you're responsible for its delivery. Responsibility's capacity is about actually describing the ability to act in a responsible way. So this includes things like, can you reflect on the consequences of the actions that have been taken? Are you able to form quite clear intentions about actions? And can you deliberately choose a course of action? If we go to virtue responsibility, this is really about describing the character of responsibility, and that might mean things like how do you balance conflicting duties, desires, and ethical demands in a given situation. Obligation, this one tends to have quite an ethical bent to it as well. So this is an ability to ensure that certain actions are going to be performed, and it could be ethical in that if we think of the train driver again. So we might say, well, the train driver has a responsibility to ensure that their passengers arrive at their destination safely. So we've got an ethical expectation here about what that person or individual needs to do. Accountability is, what you would expect. It is the requirement to account for something that has happened, or at least to be able to describe a set of events and your role within them. So this is really about providing justifiable explanations about how something has happened or why it's happened. Blameworthiness is really about assigning blame for an event or an action. And liability, the requirement to rectify or make reparations for an event or an action that has occurred. Now, that wasn't just a kind of a cheap ploy to kind of confuse the issue and say, oh, like you've got to consider all of these things. The quickest way and the most useful way to actually look at this information is to say, if you look at 1 through to 4, they're all descriptive accounts of responsibility. So they're really about saying, this is the case or it's not the case. If you start to look at 5 through 9, these are normative accounts of responsibility. So that starts to shift us into that space of thinking about, we're making, normative or evaluative judgments about behaviour or expectations or standards or norms of responsibility that we might expect. And so if you break that down even further again, you look at 5 and 6, those two are forward-looking in terms of we're trying to build something in. 7, 8, and 9 are backward-looking. They're after the event. And so just having a sense of descriptive, normative, forward and backward-looking responsibility is actually going to colour the way we think about responsibility. But having complicated things already as 9 different accounts of responsibility, how do organisations prioritise responsibility? And I want to draw on a different piece of research now that's just come out last month. So in the responsible innovation space, we work with a lot of European institutions because they've been working on this concept for the last 10 years. And some of our colleagues in, well, actually all across Europe have just done a study of 217 organisations, and what they were looking for among these 200 organisations was, how do they think about responsible innovation in the way they deliver their work? How do they actually activate or embed responsible practice in their work, and what kind of hinders them in doing that? And the combination of these 200, or the breakdown of these 200, it's worth knowing this before I show you the results, is that they talked to 38 research funders, both public and private, 134 universities, 30 private companies, and 15 civil society organisations. So what I'm going to show you now, this is just a table of different dimensions of responsibility that were identified by these 217 organisations. And I'm less interested in the prioritisation or the kind of percentages down the right-hand side of the table, because when I look at that and I see education at the top, I immediately think, well, you know, that probably wouldn't be the top priority. If the CSIRO was doing this kind of test, it would be in there, but it wouldn't be the top. But we had 134 universities. But what's interesting about this list is that these 13 kind of dimensions of responsibility end up being quite common across these different kinds of organisations. So as much as we might say the order of these things would change depending on the nature of the organisation, there tends to generally be broad agreement that things like education, societal impacts, ethics, equality and diversity, sustainability, and so on become recognised as the main areas of responsibility that organisations will be working in. And so I don't know how that kind of matches up to your own organisation and your own kind of professional practice, but this is what they have found. But what I want to do is now kind of take you to, how do those different organisations actually enact the responsibility? Because this is where it starts to get, I think, a little bit more interesting. And so the answer, of course, is it depends. Like all great answers, it depends. But what they do find is that the practice of responsible innovation over, you know, this 10-year period where it's been, you know, quite dominant in the European research funding, it's quite poorly institutionalized. So in some cases, people haven't heard of it, they understand responsibility, but their perceptions of responsibility are highly varied. And what they can draw out is that the nature of the organisation will actually drive the kind of response that we see quite generally. So in civil society organisations, what they found is their responsibility and the way they embed that practice tends to be much more outwardly focused. So they prioritise collaboration. They often host events about particular things to raise awareness. By contrast, private companies will tend to be more internally focused when they're thinking about how to embed responsible practice in their organisation. They'll formalise those commitments in strategies and their internal guidelines. Universities. In this study, they were found to resemble private companies in their orientation. So again, tending to be much more internally focused and kind of building that, you know, their ethics and their practice into their internal guidelines and strategies. And then finally, the private and public funders, well, because they have the option to do this, obviously, tended to use funding specific tools to incentivise responsible practices. And so I thought, so not only do we have these different versions of responsibility and, you know, quite a few different priorities that people will be kind of considering in the way they enact their responsibility, the structure of their organisation, again, is going to change the way they express this. So what does this all mean? And so this is my last slide, and I actually want to come back to the research that we've been doing in CSIRO, which is actually about, you know, how do you embed responsible innovation in really broad portfolios of science and technology development? And so some of our questions at first were, if the portfolio is broad, does that mean responsibility looks different? Is there something very special about AI that's completely different to synthetic biology, that's completely different again to hydrogen? And so what we find is that there are actually some common things that come up time and time again. And very quickly on this slide, and this work was done for us in 2018 by Julia Stam, who did a literature review across responsible innovation practices, our domains of science, and also interviewed our scientists. And what we found were these things. So human autonomy comes up. And I think this is a very interesting question to both start with and finish with, because how do we kind of preserve human autonomy in the face of some of these questions, I guess, about science and what technology will look like and change and how it will change our lives in the future? And I was listening to a presentation by Simon Longstaff last week where he said, you know, when we start, do we actually think that humans occupy some place of special consideration in these conversations, or are they just one of the other network considerations that we need to factor in? And really, I thought that was a beautiful way of kind of positioning that, because the way you start with that question and answer that question will kind of colour everything that happens after it. Big data comes up time and time again, and it's in many of the applications that I described in our Future Science program. Determinism, privacy, security, all of those questions. Responsibility for us came up as one consideration, but it tended to be about inequalities. How well do we anticipate inequalities? How well do we understand different perspectives and have built those in? But in particular for people working in the research or scientific space, what are the responsibilities of those people creating new areas of science, creating new technologies, and particularly the question about, is there a requirement of us to look at secondary findings and secondary uses, and how would we manage that? Inclusive deliberation, when, how, who. I would say that is not a question that is specific to technology, but it happens across society generally. The role of trust building. I mean, I've done a lot of research on trust, but I'm always interested in what we think we need it for and how we think we're going to get it and how we have evidence around that. Governance and regulation. Does it need to change for different kinds of technologies? Or is there something specific about these areas? Interdisciplinarity, but also how we build knowledge across multiple disciplines and from outside the areas of expertise. A particularly interesting one is how we go about embedding human values in machines and how well we understand what human values are and what we would like them or think they can do for us. And my very favourite question, which I'm a philosopher, and so of course this is my favourite question because it's deeply existential, is what does it actually mean to be human, both now and in the future? And again, like the question of human autonomy, how do we go about answering that question? And I always think, you know, this isn't a question of what, you know, it's not about what does it mean to be me, it's what does it mean to be Justine or Tony or kind of Bob or, you know, or Tina. What does it mean to be human? It's a really, really collective question. And so the responsibility that's kind of laden into the way we go about answering that question is significant. And I like that question because it actually kind of weaves its way back very nicely to the central theme of the summit, which is of course about how do you go about creating a future where humanity is actually at the heart of your tech in quite a practical way, and not just in that kind of aspirational and, you know, this is my intention, even if I fall well short. So I'm going to leave it there and see if there's any questions. So I will stop sharing my screen now, and thank you.
Fantastic, Justine. Thank you so much for that. And it was a great way to kick off the week on responsible tech. I'm just wondering, I mean, CSIRO has a lot of, as you went through that list, there's a lot of bleeding edge research that you're doing. When you're talking to people about embedding responsible innovation, do they see you as a force for good or a bit of a break? Or I mean, how, in terms of speed, where do they think that you come in the picture? How do they review you?
Yeah, okay. Like, this is a great question, and I would say, look, across the board, you know, not all of my colleagues are probably welcoming me with open arms because they've got a ton of work to do, right? And sometimes it feels extra. And some of them are saying, please, please, please come on down. And it's a very interesting question, I think, which is about, and I haven't heard this as much in terms of responsibility, because it's interesting that the phrase responsible innovation feels intuitively right to people. I think, oh yeah, being responsible is probably a good thing. And I definitely want to be innovative. You know, that feels like a good thing too. But where I have heard the tension expressed is in ethics versus innovation. And I've definitely heard that come up in some portfolios much more than others. So again, there is a little bit of variation across the board, but that feeling that ethics is going to stop me from being innovative. And I thought this idea that those two things are mutually exclusive, you know, is problematic, because I thought, wow, we don't actually do our science and our technology like in this vacuum where the world is not there and we're just going to like insert it somewhere along the way. So I'd actually say there's actually a lot of support for this, and it is kind of interesting And, you know, our future science platforms they're not commercial areas. They're, you know, we're looking for places where the technology readiness level is very, very low. So as much as I've described some things that look familiar, the work that happens in those platforms is very early stage research. Not all of it will work, we know that, but we think it's worth going there. And so the ability to ask some of these questions really early on is also kind of new work in that kind of social science space for us as well.
Thank you, Justine. I think that just about brings us to time. Now, I'd just like to extend again a really warm thank you for your time today and for giving us all that food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.